He walked out smiling, the particular smile of a man who has decided in advance that nothing tonight will get through his defenses. Ricky Gervais had been doing interviews for 25 years. He was very good at them, disarmingly good, dangerously good, the kind of good that looks like openness but is actually a very sophisticated form of control. He would say outrageous things, provocative things, things that made headlines and sparked conversations and filled column inches for days. And in the middle of all of that noise, in the middle of all that apparent candor, he would never say the thing that actually mattered. The thing underneath the thing, the room he never took anyone into. He settled into the guest chair with the easy confidence of a man who had been the most comfortable person in every room he'd ever entered. The late show audience greeted him warmly. They always did, they couldn't help it, and Ricky acknowledged it with that familiar combination of genuine pleasure and performed self-deprecation that had become as much his signature as anything he had ever written. He looked at home. He always looked at home. That was the skill. Stephen greeted him, the band played, and for the first several minutes everything was exactly what it was supposed to be: sharp, funny, slightly dangerous. Ricky at full capacity, Ricky in control. He made a joke about the audience, another about the studio, a third about Stephen's tie that landed so cleanly it seemed almost unfair. The room loved him. The room always loved him. And Ricky received the love with that particular combination of gratitude and irony that allowed him to have it without seeming to need it. That was the performance. That had always been the performance. They talked about the new project, a film this time darker than his usual work, the kind of material that reminded people every few years that the man behind the comedy was operating at a level that comedy alone couldn't fully contain. They talked about the creative process, about what it meant to still be taking risks at this stage of a career that had already redefined what British comedy could be. Ricky was expansive and thoughtful and precisely as revealing as he intended to be, which was to say, not very. And then Stephen set down his note cards. "Ricky," he said, "I want to talk about The Office." Ricky smiled. "Everyone wants to talk about The Office." "I know," Stephen said, "but I want to talk about something specific, not about the show's success, not about what it meant for television. I want to ask you about the writing process, about where David Brent actually came from." Ricky's smile held. "He came from observation," he said. "From watching a certain kind of person in a certain kind of environment, the office middle manager who needs to be liked more than he needs to be respected, who mistakes tolerance for affection, who—" "That's the answer you give," Stephen said gently. "I want the other one." The smile flickered just slightly, just enough. Ricky looked at Stephen for a long moment, and in that moment, in the space between the prepared answer and the real one, something shifted in the room that everyone in the studio felt without being able to name. The temperature changed. The air changed. 300 people leaned forward without realizing they were doing it. "The other one," Ricky said quietly. Stephen waited. He was very good at waiting. "I was writing the pilot," Ricky began slowly. His voice was different now, the performance cadence gone, something more private in its place. "This was 2001. We were working out of a tiny office, me and Steve, barely any money, barely any space, trying to build this character, this man who desperately needed to be the most entertaining person in any room he entered, who needed the laugh, who needed the validation, who could not tolerate the idea of a room not finding him interesting, not finding him worth their attention." He paused. "And I was writing these scenes where David does something painfully, catastrophically misjudged, where he mistakes tolerance for affection, where he tells a joke that goes wrong and then keeps going, keeps escalating because he can't read the room or won't read the room, which might be worse. And I thought I was writing about someone I'd observed, someone I'd seen from the outside, someone who existed at a comfortable distance from who I was." Stephen was very still. "And then one night, I remember exactly where I was, sitting at my desk very late, everyone else had gone home, I read back what I'd written that day. And something happened that I have never talked about." Ricky stopped, started again. "I read a scene where David is performing for his staff, not performing in the theatrical sense, just performing the way he always performed, the way he couldn't stop performing even in rooms where nobody was asking him to. And nobody in the scene was responding the way he needed them to. They were tolerating him, being polite, and David couldn't see it, or couldn't let himself see it. And he just kept going, kept pushing, kept offering more of himself to a room that had already decided it had enough." He looked at his hands. "And I realized I knew exactly what David was feeling in that moment, not intellectually, not as a writer who had observed a type of person and was translating them onto the page. From the inside, from somewhere I recognized the specific desperation of that moment, the need for the laugh, the panic that arrives when the laugh doesn't come." The way you keep going anyway because stopping would mean acknowledging that you've lost the room, and losing the room is, for someone like David, the worst thing that can happen. The thing he has no way of surviving. The studio was quiet in a way that had nothing to do with silence and everything to do with attention. "How long have you known that about yourself?" Stephen asked. His voice was careful, low. Ricky looked at him, and the smile, the armor that had been in place since he walked through the curtain, was simply gone, not removed deliberately, not lowered by choice, simply no longer there, the way weather changes when the pressure system shifts. "Always," he said. "I've always known it. I've just spent a very long time making sure nobody else did." "What are you afraid of?" Stephen asked. "If people know." Ricky was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that has weight that you can feel pressing against the walls of a room. "David Brent is a tragic figure," he said finally. "That's what makes the show work. That's what gives it the thing underneath the comedy, the thing that makes people uncomfortable while they're laughing, that makes the laughter feel slightly wrong even as it's happening. Because David is a man who needs something that nobody around him is able to give him. Not because they're cruel or indifferent, because what he needs, the specific. Unconditional, total validation of being the most interesting person in the room, is not something anyone can give anyone else. It has to live inside you, it has to come from you, and David can't find it inside himself. He can only feel it when the room reflects it back at him, and the room almost never does. Subscribe and leave a comment, because the most powerful part of this story is still ahead. Stephen stood up from behind his desk quietly, without announcement, and walked around to sit on the edge of it, facing Ricky directly. "And you wrote that," Stephen said carefully, "from the inside." "I wrote it from the inside," Ricky said. "Without fully knowing I was doing it. I thought I was building a character. I thought I was doing what writers do, observing, synthesizing, translating the external world into something that could live on a page. But somewhere in that process, without realizing it, I stopped observing someone else and started describing myself. And then I dressed it in comedy, which is what I do with everything that frightens me. I make it funny. I put it in a joke or a character or a performance, and that creates enough distance from it that I don't have to look at it directly, that I can be in the room with it without," he stopped, "without it being about me." The first tear came then, quiet and surprising even to Ricky. You could see it in the fractional widening of his eyes when he felt it arrive, the brief involuntary check of his own composure. He didn't wipe it away, he let it be there. "The show ran for 2 series, he continued, his voice steady despite the tear on his cheek. "And at the end, the Christmas special, David gets something. He gets a kind of redemption. He gets a woman who sees him, actually sees him past all the performance and the desperation and the need, and chooses him anyway. Not because he's entertaining, not because he's useful, just because of who he is underneath all of that. And I wrote that ending, and I believed I was writing it for David." He paused. "I think I was writing it for myself. I think I was trying to prove to myself that it was possible, that you could be seen, actually seen, not just applauded, and for that to be enough. That you didn't have to keep performing forever just to feel like you were worth something." Stephen looked at him. "Did it work?" Stephen asked quietly. "Writing it, did it help?" Ricky thought about that, really thought about it, not reaching for the answer that would land well, but actually going somewhere to find the real one. "Yes and no," he said. "The work helps, it always helps. When something frightens me, I put it in the work, and the work gives it somewhere to go. And that's been my way of surviving the thing I'm talking about. The need, the panic. I channel it into something that has a frame around it, that has an audience and a defined end and a context that makes it mean something beyond just my own interior noise." He paused. "But the thing itself doesn't go away. You don't write your way out of who you are. You find a way to use it, to make it useful, to turn it into something that connects with other people instead of just terrifying you in the bathroom at 3 in the morning." His voice was rougher now. The tear had been joined by another, both present on his cheeks, unhurried, not performed. "David Brent exists because I understood him from the inside," Ricky said. "That's the truth I've never said publicly. The reason he landed the way he did, the reason he got inside people, the reason audiences found him unbearable and recognizable and funny and heartbreaking all at once, is that he wasn't constructed. He wasn't assembled from observation and craft and the intelligent application of technique. He was confessed. I confessed him. And then I disguised the confession as a character study and put it on television and watched the whole world recognize something in him without knowing what they were recognizing." Stephen looked out at the audience for a moment, then back at Ricky. "You know what I think," Stephen said. "I think what you just described is the most honest account of how great creative work actually happens that I have ever heard on this show. Because you're not describing failure, you're not describing weakness, you're describing the source, You're describing where the real thing comes from, not from observation or craft or technique, but from the place in yourself that you're most afraid to show anyone. And the reason David Brent worked, the reason he still works 25 years later, is that audiences felt that source even when they didn't know it was there. They felt the truth of it. They always do. Something moved across Ricky's face, complicated and slow, the grief still present, but alongside it now something else, something that looked like it might be relief. The particular relief of a thing that has been kept in a closed room for a very long time and has finally been allowed to breathe. The difference between me and David, Ricky said quietly, is that I found something else. I found the work. I found that if I put the need into something, into writing, into creating, into making things that outlast the moment, it has somewhere to go that doesn't require a room full of people to validate it in real time. David never found that. David only had the room, and the room was never enough. Is the work enough for you? Stephen asked. Ricky considered this, really considered it. Most days, he said, most days the work is enough, and on the days it isn't, he stopped. The hint of a smile returned, but different now, smaller, more real, more his. On the days it isn't, I go on television and I make people laugh and I feel it for an hour and then I go home. Stephen laughed, a real one. That's the most honest thing you've ever said on television, Stephen said. Don't tell anyone, Ricky said. I have a reputation to protect. The applause that followed started slowly and built, not because it was prompted, but because 300 people had just been taken somewhere they hadn't expected to go. The room behind the comedy. The thing underneath the thing. The confession that 25 years of interviews had never reached. David Brent existed because Ricky Gervais understood him from the inside. And David Brent's tragedy, his endless, aching, almost unwatchable need to be loved by rooms that were never going to love him the way he needed, was never entirely fiction. It was a confession. Dressed in comedy. The way Ricky dressed everything that frightened him. That night, laughter gave way to grace, and television remembered what it was for.